Snow buried Hollow Rock like a shroud, and in the stillness of that morning in 1886, the town seemed to hold its breath. On the platform of the depot, a single figure remained after the train had hissed and gone. A young woman, her scarf pale against the storm, her suitcase small enough to suggest she had left behind more than she had brought. Mara Ellison's cheeks burned red from wind, her lips trembled blue, but her eyes held the kind of calm that only comes to those who have already known loss. She was supposed to be met by a man named Thomas Langston, her husband by proxy, a man whose words had promised safety, warmth, and the beginning of a life reborn. But no one came. The longer she waited, the colder the truth became. Hollow Rock had no Thomas Langston. The townsfolk did not linger to comfort her. A few glanced at her as they passed, boots crunching hard against the icy planks, but no one stopped. In places like Hollow Rock, pity was a luxury too expensive to spend on strangers. The station agent muttered, "Best send for the sheriff." And when the word sheriff left his lips, those nearby stiffened. For Sheriff Ezra Kane was not a man whose presence brought ease. He was a widower whose grief had calcified into silence, a man with eyes like weathered iron and a past the town knew better than to speak aloud. Ezra arrived on a black horse, his duster flung with frost, his hat brim shadowing eyes that had buried both wife and peace. When he dismounted, no one greeted him. They parted instead, letting him through like water yielding to stone. His boots struck the platform. Mara stood straighter though her knees wobbled, her suitcase held like a shield. Ezra looked at her once, a single long look that cut through pretense, then asked in a voice low and unyielding, "Name of the man you came to marry?" Her breath fogged in the air. "Thomas Langston," she whispered. Ezra's jaw set. "There is no Thomas Langston in Hollow Rock." The silence between them seemed to stretch with the snow. For a heartbeat, Mara's eyes closed, as if she had always known this would be the answer. The scarf around her throat fluttered like a flag of surrender. She did not protest, did not collapse. Only her hands tightened on the leather handle of her suitcase until her gloves strained. Ezra, who had once watched a woman he loved wait in vain for help that never came, felt something twist in his chest, sharp as a spur. "You'll come with me," he said curtly. He didn't offer it as a kindness, nor as a threat. It was simply the only choice that kept her alive. The horse carried them through the storm, her arms stiff at his back, her breath shallow in the hollow of his coat. Hollow Rock faded behind them, its windows glowing like eyes that chose not to see. Ezra said nothing of his thoughts, of the memory of a fire that had once stolen everything from him, of the small girl waiting at his cabin who spoke less each year. He only thought, another stranger to bury, or perhaps not. When they reached his door, he told her, 3 nights, no more. But as he glanced at her scarf, pinned with a brass brooch shaped like a sprig of pressed leaves, his stomach turned cold. He had seen that symbol once before on a wanted poster for men who lured the desperate West with letters and left them in the ground. The house where silence lives. Ezra Kane's cabin sat a mile north of town, half hidden by pines that swayed and groaned in the winter wind. The boards were thick, the shutters reinforced, yet silence lived inside as though it had been nailed into the walls. When Ezra pushed the door open, a wash of wood smoke drifted out. A small figure peeked from the shadows, a girl of 7, her braids uneven, eyes dark with a solemnity children should not carry. This was May, Ezra's daughter. She didn't smile, didn't speak, only looked at Mara as if measuring whether she was ghost or flesh. "This is temporary," Ezra said as he hung his hat and brushed snow from his coat. His words were aimed at Mara, but May flinched slightly, like she'd heard them before. Mara, clutching her suitcase, nodded once. 3 nights, she repeated softly, her voice careful, as though she feared the silence might shatter if she raised it too high. The stove fought to warm the cabin, its iron belly glowing red. Mara eased closer, her hands outstretched, fingers trembling more from nerves than cold now. Ezra poured her a tin cup of coffee, black and bitter. She thanked him, though she did not drink. May edged nearer, drawn not by curiosity, but something quieter, perhaps the need to feel another presence in a house that had forgotten laughter. Mara crouched slightly, offering a smile meant only for the child. "Hello," she whispered. May blinked, then retreated behind her father's leg. Ezra cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the way the room seemed to shift around this stranger. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Missouri," Mara said. She hesitated, eyes dropping to her boots. "My family. I left them behind." Ezra nodded once. He understood the weight of things left unsaid. He carried them too, the kind of burdens that did not lift with miles. That night, when the wind pressed against the shutters and the fire fell low, Ezra sat at his desk, pretending to write. His hand dipped quill to ink, but the page stayed blank. He wasn't watching his work. He was watching her. Mara sat still on the chair near the stove, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her suitcase unopened at her feet. Every so often her fingers twitched, a reflex of someone trained to expect consequences for any small movement. She did not cry. She did not ask questions. She only sat as though patience were her last possession. Ezra's gaze drifted to the shelf behind him, where a single photograph rested. A woman with soft eyes and a smile that still haunted him. His late wife, Clara. She had died 4 winters ago, and in her last days she had whispered to him, "Strength is not silence, Ezra. Strength is choosing to love again, even when it might break you." He had buried those words with her. Now, watching Mara's quiet stillness, he felt them stirring, unwelcome and sharp, as though silence itself were being tested. When Ezra finally rose, he crossed the cabin in 3 steps and set a small brass key on the table beside Mara's untouched coffee. "There's a spare room," he said. "Upstairs. First door on the left." Mara lifted her eyes slowly. She looked at the key, then at him, unsure if gratitude would offend him. Finally, she gathered it with trembling fingers. 3 nights, she whispered again. Ezra gave no reply, only turned back to the fire, but inside, something long frozen began, against his will, to thaw, a town of ribbons and knives. The next morning brought a sky the color of tin, the kind that pressed down heavy on the shoulders of Hollow Rock. Ezra saddled his horse for patrol, leaving Mara with May and a quiet warning. "If you must go into town, keep your head low." He did not say why, but Mara understood. In a place like this, strangers were measured first by gossip, then by usefulness. Still, Mara could not keep May cloistered. The child had outgrown her shoes, her toes pressing against worn leather, so she wrapped herself in Ezra's old coat, took May's small hand, and led her toward town. The snow along the road had crusted hard, breaking beneath their boots like thin glass. Mara felt the weight of unseen eyes even before she reached the square. Hollow Rock was not a large place, yet its silence could turn sharp when it wished to. The mercantile bell gave a thin chime as she stepped inside. The warmth of the stove met her first, followed by the scent of soap, calico, and suspicion. Behind the counter, Matilda Pike looked up, her corset pulled tight, her smile tighter still. "Well," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie, "isn't this a surprise? We don't often see brides come without their grooms." A ripple of amusement drifted among the women bent over bolts of fabric. Mara kept her chin lifted, though her cheeks burned. She turned her attention to the shelves. Thread, flower, ribbons laid in neat rows. May clutched her hand harder. "We're just here for shoes," Mara said quietly. Matilda's smile did not falter. "Shoes for a child in a sheriff's coat. Curious, folks are already talking, you know. A widow's house is no place for a misplaced bride." Her words slid like knives, polite on the surface, cruel beneath. Before Mara could answer, a soft voice cut through from the far end of the store. Shoes, you said? Inez Delgado, the seamstress, stepped forward with measured grace. She carried a box under her arm, her dark eyes steady and kind. I keep children's sizes in the back. May can try them on while you look at fabric. She offered Mara a nod so slight it was almost secret, a gesture that said, "Not everyone here wishes you harm." Mara exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She bent to May, whispering, "It's all right," then guided her toward Inez. For a moment, relief softened the hard edges of the morning, but then the mercantile's door swung open and the room stilled. Ezra Kane stepped inside, his presence cutting the air like a blade. The chatter died at once. His boots thudded heavy on the floorboards as he crossed to the counter. "Problem?" he asked, though his eyes never left Matilda. Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Why, Sheriff, none at all. We were only welcoming our new arrival." Ezra's gaze hardened, his voice low but carrying. "Then welcome her proper. Folks don't need to spend their tongues when they're here to spend their coin." The heat from the stove seemed to flare hotter. Matilda busied her hands with ribbon, but no words came. Ezra glanced toward Mara, and though his face gave nothing away, the room itself seemed to bend around his authority. For the first time since stepping off that train, Mara felt she was not entirely alone. As they left, the bell chimed again, sharp as judgment. Outside, Mara whispered, "You didn't have to." Ezra adjusted his hat against the wind. "A man under my roof gets respect. That goes for you too." But Mara caught the flicker of something else in his eyes when he looked at her brooch, glinting faintly in the gray light. Recognition and unease, the alias that never lived. Night fell over Hollow Rock with a sharp cold that made the stars glitter like broken glass. Inside his cabin, Ezra sat hunched over the sheriff's ledger, a single lantern casting shadows long enough to look like ghosts. He turned page after page, running his finger along names of settlers, shopkeepers, ranch hands. No Thomas Langston appeared, not in land deeds, not in taxes, not even in the register of train arrivals. Whoever had written those letters to Mara had conjured a ghost and sent her chasing after it. Mara sat nearby, mending one of May's stockings with a needle borrowed from Inez. The quiet between them was steady, interrupted only by the pop of the stove and the scrape of Ezra's quill. Every so often, Ezra's gaze drifted to her hands. They worked with the calm precision of someone trying to keep themselves from unraveling entirely. She had opened her suitcase earlier, and Ezra noticed there was little inside. 2 dresses, worn but neatly folded, and the letters that had led her west. She kept them tied with ribbon as if still afraid to let go. At last, Ezra spoke, his voice gravel against the silence. "Langston's not in the books. Not in the county, not even in the territory. Far as I can see." Mara's needle paused. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't look up. "Then who wrote to me?" Ezra leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "That's the question." He hesitated, then asked, "May I?" Gesturing toward the stack of letters, Mara studied him, her eyes uncertain. Finally, she slid them across the table. Ezra untied the ribbon, smoothing the pages. The words were honeyed, promises of hearth and home, of a man eager for a wife to share his quiet fortune. But Ezra wasn't reading the words so much as the strokes, the curl of the G, the flourish at the end of each Y. They stirred a memory like the echo of a voice you almost recognize in a crowded room. He closed the letters, setting them aside carefully. "This hand, I've seen it before." Mara searched his face. "From where?" Ezra didn't answer, not yet. The thought unsettled him too deeply. Instead, he changed course. "What made you answer a stranger's call, Mara?" Her eyes flickered toward the fire. "Because back in Missouri, there's nothing left to answer me." Her voice cracked on the edge of honesty, though she tried to steady it. "Better to gamble on hope than sit still in ruin." Ezra said nothing, but inside his chest something shifted. He knew ruin well. He knew the way silence could eat a person alive. And he knew handwriting. He had spent half his life studying it on warrants and wanted posters, which is why, when he asked his deputy the next day to write out a requisition for supplies, and Burke Harlan's hand curved the very same way, Ezra felt his pulse stumble. Burke looked up, smiling faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who thought himself clever. Ezra tucked the requisition into his coat, his face unreadable. But inside, the truth had already started to burn. Thomas Langston never lived, but Burke Harlan did. And if Burke was the hand behind those letters, then Mara Ellison hadn't just been abandoned. She'd been bait, the ring of ash and a name in smoke. The wind carried the stench of smoke long before Ezra reached the ridge. By the time he arrived, the barn was already a skeleton, its beams collapsing in showers of sparks. Rancher Henry Tolliver stood in the snow, hat clutched to his chest, cursing the men who'd left him with nothing but ash. Ezra leapt from his horse, throwing buckets with the few neighbors who'd come running, though the fire was too far gone to save. Still he worked until his arms ached, until the last flames hissed themselves out against the snow. When silence fell again, Ezra crouched near the blackened wreckage. He sifted through the charred remains with the edge of his glove. That was when he saw it, a twist of kindling bound in a pattern far too deliberate to be accident. He froze, his heart kicking hard against his ribs. He had seen this signature before. The fire that had taken Clara, his wife, 4 winters ago, had begun with kindling laid just so, a trick meant to make a blaze leap fast and trap its prey. Whoever had burned this barn was no stranger to murder by flame. Beside the twisted wood lay a single brass button, its edges scorched but the emblem still clear, a tiny pressed sprig, almost identical to the brooch Mara wore pinned to her scarf. Ezra's breath caught. The symbol wasn't just decoration, it was a mark, a brand that tied Mara's misfortune to the fire that had destroyed his family. He pocketed the button, his jaw set hard. For a long time he said nothing, only mounted his horse and rode home through the storm. Snow stung his face, but it did nothing to cool the blaze that now burned inside him. Back at the cabin, Mara was seated by the fire with May curled in her lap, the child's braids loose, her tiny hands clutching Mara's sleeve. The sight was so gentle it nearly undid him. Yet when Mara looked up, Ezra's gaze was sharp as steel. "Where did you get that brooch?" he demanded. Mara blinked, startled. She lifted her hand instinctively to touch the pin. "It was given to me, in Missouri." It came with the letters. Ezra drew the button from his pocket, tossing it onto the table where it clattered like a gunshot. Then the men who wrote those letters lit this fire. Same mark, same hand. Mara stared at it, her face draining of color. Her lips trembled, but her voice steadied. "Then I wasn't meant for a husband at all. I was meant for a grave." Ezra held her gaze, searching for lies and finding none. The room went quiet save for May's soft breathing against Mara's shoulder. In that silence, Ezra heard more than fear. He heard the echo of his own grief. The night Clara's life was stolen in flame. Mara placed a hand over May's hair, eyes shining not with tears but with resolve. "I came west thinking I was chasing hope. But maybe I've been chasing the men who deserve justice." Ezra's breath slowed. Justice. The word carried weight heavier than bullets. He turned toward the window where snow pressed thick against the glass, and he knew the trail ahead was darker than either of them had guessed. The debt of the dead. The next days in Hollow Rock dragged heavy, as if time itself was reluctant to move. Ezra Kane could not shake the weight of that brass button in his pocket, nor the memory of the twisted kindling in the ashes. At night he lay awake listening to the crackle of the stove, every snap of wood reminding him of Clara's screams swallowed by fire. And now this woman, Mara, had walked into his life carrying the same cursed mark. Coincidence had no place in Ezra's world, only debts unpaid. On the third morning, Mara came to him with a folded sheet of paper worn thin from being handled. Her eyes were steady, but her voice quiet. "I found this in my satchel. I thought it was just scrap, but look." She placed it on his desk. Ezra unfolded the page. It was torn from a freight ledger, the columns of numbers and shipments messy and half-burned. But in the margin, scrawled in heavy ink, was the sprig symbol again. Beneath it, a single word, L-A-R-A-M-I-E. Ezra's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "Birch Laramie," he muttered. The name tasted of rust and dust. A cattle thief turned firebug, a man who had ridden the edge of the law for years. Laramie had been a friend once, closer to Burke Harlan than to Ezra, but their paths had crossed plenty. Ezra had seen him laugh in saloons, cards spread wide, before bodies started turning up cold in his wake. When Clara's fire claimed her life, Ezra had suspected Laramie, but without proof the law was nothing but smoke. Now the smoke had returned. Mara sat across from him, her hands clasped. "So this is bigger than letters. They've done this before. To me, to others." Ezra rubbed a hand over his jaw, staring at the ledger scrap. "They lure women west with promises, strip them of what little they carry, then leave them to die. And when a man gets in their way," his voice faltered, "they light fires." The door creaked. Burke Harlan strode in, spurs jangling, hat tipped low. "Sheriff, heard about the barn. Bad luck for Tolliver." His eyes flicked toward Mara, lingering too long before sliding back to Ezra. "Anything I can do to help?" Ezra studied him, every muscle coiled. "Tell me, Burke. You ever ride with Birch Laramie?" Burke's smile came slow, lazy. "Long time ago, before I wore the badge." "Why?" Ezra reached into his pocket, letting the brass button glint in the lamplight. "Because his mark is burning its way back into Hollow Rock." For the briefest second, Burke's smile wavered. His thumb twitched at his belt, then steadied. "Marks don't mean much. You start seeing ghosts, Sheriff. Maybe it's the past eating you." Ezra's eyes narrowed. Or maybe it's the present trying to finish what the past began. The silence between them was a standoff without pistols. Mara sat rigid, every nerve in her body taut. She could feel it, something dark and dangerous tying these men together, a thread that might strangle them all if pulled. Burke tipped his hat and turned to leave, but his voice floated back like smoke. "Careful chasing Laramie, Ezra. Some debts aren't meant to be paid." When the door shut, Ezra stared at it for a long moment, then turned to Mara. "This isn't just your fight anymore. Clara's blood is in this too, and I'll see it answered." Mara's gaze met his, her brooch catching the firelight. "Then we ride it together, whatever it costs." Ezra felt the weight of her words settle deep in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was chasing justice or if justice was chasing him. Gunpowder promises. The night sky over Hollow Rock was clear, brittle, and sharp, every star glimmering as though the heavens were keeping watch. Ezra Kane had been sheriff long enough to recognize the feel of a trap when it was closing, and the air carried that same taut weight. A rider had come pounding into town earlier, breathless with a story of stolen cattle out past Dead Man's Ridge. Ezra knew it for bait, the timing too neat, the rumor too thin. Still, he saddled his horse because a sheriff couldn't ignore a call, even when it smelled like blood. Before leaving, he set his rifle against the cabin wall and gave Mara a single level look. "Bolt the door. Keep the fire high." His gaze softened when it landed on May, curled in her blanket. "No one opens this door but me." Mara nodded, but unease rippled through her. She had seen the way Burke's eyes followed her in town, the way his smile lingered like a knife not yet drawn. When Ezra's horse disappeared into the dark, the cabin grew too still, the kind of silence that makes you hear footsteps where there are none. It wasn't long before a shadow slipped across the frosted window. The latch rattled. Then the door creaked open as if the night itself had decided to walk in. Burke Harlan stepped inside, his boots slow on the planks, his hat brim low, grin wide enough to chill the blood. "Evenin', Miss Ellison," he drawled, his voice too soft for comfort. "Or should I call you Mrs. Langston? Shame about that husband of yours, never showin'." Mara stood by the hearth, her hands tight around May's shoulders. "You need to leave," Burke laughed, low and cruel. Now. Sheriff's out chasing ghosts, and here you are, sittin' pretty in his house. Folks might wonder what spell you cast. You think Hollow Rock's gonna welcome you. They'll never see you as more than a stray." He took a step closer, eyes glinting. "But I could fix that for you. I know the men who wrote those letters. I know the mark on that brooch. Walk away with me at sunrise, and maybe the fire don't come knocking on this door." Mara's heart pounded. She had faced disappointment, loneliness, hunger, but never this. She looked to the rifle propped against the wall just within reach. Her voice trembled, but she forced strength into it. "If you touch her," she said, pulling May behind her, "you'll lose the hand you touch her with." Burke's grin widened, but his eyes narrowed. He moved toward the rifle, slow as a predator. "You think you can use that?" Guns don't care for trembling hands. Mara's palm closed around the stock before he could. She lifted it, the barrel wavering but steady enough to make his step falter. For a long moment the cabin was filled only with the hiss of the fire and the sound of her ragged breath. "You don't know what I've survived," she whispered, her finger brushing the trigger. "But you're about to find out." Burke tilted his head, smile gone now, replaced by something darker. "Careful, girl. Gunpowder makes promises you can't take back." And in that fragile instant, with the rifle between them and May's frightened eyes fixed on her, Mara realized she was no longer the woman who stepped off that train waiting to be claimed. She was claiming herself, at the end of a barrel if she had to. Love declared at gunpoint. The ridge stretched pale and merciless under the moonlight, snow drifting like smoke over the sage. Ezra Kane rode hard into that frozen silence, his breath ragged, his instincts screaming he had been lured. Dead Man's Ridge had always been a graveyard of promises, wagon wheels rotted into the soil, campfires snuffed by wind long ago. Tonight, it was worse. 3 silhouettes waited against the snow, Birch Laramie and 2 of his riders. Their rifles glimmered, their faces carved with smirks that smelled of blood. "You ride right into the snare, Ezra," Laramie called, his voice booming against the cold. "Thought you'd have learned after last time. Shame about your woman. Clara burned brighter than any barn." The words tore through Ezra like hot iron. His hand twitched near his revolver, though he knew 3 barrels against 1 was death. Still, rage steadied him. "You'll answer for her," he growled. Back at the cabin, the firelight flickered over Burke's grin as he edged closer, boots creaking slow. Mara's arms trembled from the weight of the rifle, but her stance was rooted. May whimpered behind her, clutching the hem of her skirt. Burke's smile thinned. "You ain't gonna pull that trigger. You've been waiting all your life for someone to take care of you. Well, here I am, and if you think Kane's coming back, you're a fool. Laramie'll leave him in the snow." Mara swallowed hard, fear coursing through her veins, but so did something fiercer. She took a step forward, the barrel aimed steady at his chest now. "I don't need you to take care of me. And I'm not waiting anymore." Burke's eyes flickered, something shifting in them, surprise, then anger. He lunged, hand outstretched for the barrel. Mara squeezed the trigger. The shot exploded, deafening in the cabin. The ball tore splinters from the doorframe, grazing his knuckles. Burke howled, stumbling back, his hand bleeding. For a heartbeat, silence roared louder than the gun. May screamed, clutching Mara tighter. Burke cradled his hand, teeth bared. "You will regret that." His voice cracked, no longer smooth, no longer mocking, just raw. He staggered toward the door, leaving blood in the snow as he vanished into the night. Mara's chest heaved. She set the rifle down, then knelt and wrapped May in both arms. "You're safe," she whispered, though her own body shook. The child buried her face in Mara's neck, sobbing into the warmth she trusted more than words. On the ridge, Ezra faced Laramie and his men, the odds stacked cruelly. Snow hissed on their coats, the storm whispering louder by the minute. Ezra drew his revolver slow, steady. He thought of Clara, of her last smile, of the words she left him. Then he thought of Mara, rifle in hand, refusing to be prey. "I buried one family because of you," Ezra said, his voice hard as iron. "I won't bury another." Gunfire cracked, echoing through the hills. The ridge flared with muzzle flash, the sound rolling down toward Hollow Rock like thunder. And inside the cabin, Mara's pulse raced as she pressed May close. Every shot a reminder that the man who had taken her in was fighting ghosts made of flesh and powder. The choice that names a family. The ridge thundered with gunfire, each shot ricocheting through the night like a cruel drumbeat. Ezra Kane crouched low behind a limestone outcrop, snow biting at his knees. Birch Laramie and his two riders fanned out, rifles spitting fire. The odds were wrong, but Ezra had lived most of his life against odds. He aimed carefully, fired once, and saw one rider tumble from his saddle, body rolling limp into the drifts. The victory was small, and it cost him. The other bullet seared past, cutting his shoulder, spinning him half into the snow. His breath hitched, warm blood soaking cold fabric. "You're finished, Kane," Laramie roared, advancing with the slow satisfaction of a man who believed the past was finally paying its debt. "You lost your woman, your peace, and now you'll lose the only thing you have left, your name." Ezra gritted his teeth, struggling to reload with numbing fingers. He thought of Clara, then of Mara's face when she said she would not wait anymore. For the first time in years, the thought of dying tasted bitter, not for himself, but for the people he might leave behind. Back at the cabin, Mara shoved a chair beneath the latch after Burke's bloody retreat. Her hands still shook from the shot, but her mind was clear. Ezra was out there, and he was alone. She pressed May's trembling hands into her own. "Stay here," she whispered. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it, no matter what you hear." May's eyes widened with fear. "Don't go," she pleaded, voice breaking. Mara knelt, cupping the girl's face. "I have to, because he came for us, and we don't leave him to fight alone." She pressed May's forehead with a kiss, then stood, grabbing a length of rope and the half-empty powder horn. In her heart, fear battled resolve, but her feet carried her out into the snow anyway. By the time she reached the ridge, the storm had thickened, and the air reeked of smoke and iron. She saw Ezra stagger, his revolver nearly empty, his left arm hanging useless from the wound. And opposite him stood Birch Laramie, grinning wide, rifle leveled at Ezra's chest. "End of the line," Laramie spat. "Not yet," came Mara's voice. She emerged from the trees, rifle raised, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Her hands no longer trembled. "I've come to claim what's mine." Ezra blinked, disbelief flaring into something else, something dangerously close to hope. Laramie turned, sneering. "The stray bride? You'll shoot me? You couldn't even shoot Burke clean." Mara stepped closer, her barrel unwavering. "Try me." In the same breath, Ezra lifted his revolver despite the pain, finding one last ounce of strength. The moment hung suspended, the snow swirling like ash between them. Then, May's voice carried faintly from the trail below, high and breaking. "Pa! Mara!" Ezra's heart wrenched. Laramie's head snapped toward the sound, just for an instant, and in that single heartbeat, choices were made that would shape more than lives. They would shape a family, resolution and legacy, what we choose to stand for. The ridge exploded in motion the instant May's voice broke through the storm. Birch Laramie swung his rifle toward the sound, cursing, but that single flicker of distraction was all Ezra Kane needed. With his good arm, he fired, the revolver bucking hard. The bullet struck Laramie's shoulder, spinning him sideways, his rifle dropping into the snow. Mara did not hesitate. She stepped forward, rope in hand, and struck Laramie hard across the jaw with the butt of her rifle. He fell to his knees, teeth gritting against blood. Ezra staggered forward, chest heaving, blood dark against his coat. "Bind him," he rasped. Mara moved quickly, looping the rope around Laramie's wrists, yanking it tight until his curses choked in the storm. The last rider fled into the night, hoofbeats fading across the frozen hills, but neither Ezra nor Mara gave chase. Some debts would have to wait. Laramie's sneer twisted through the blood on his lips. "You think you've won? Burke'll finish what I started. Hollow Rock's already half ours." Ezra leaned close, his breath harsh in the cold. "Not anymore. You men prey on the desperate, but this town isn't desperate. It's mine to protect. And so is she." His eyes flicked toward Mara. The words startled him as much as they did her, but once spoken, they carried a truth neither could ignore. By the time they dragged Laramie into Hollow Rock, dawn had begun to creep over the horizon, pale and reluctant. Townsfolk stirred from their homes, watching as the infamous outlaw was shoved into a cell at the sheriff's office. Whispers traveled faster than the light. Ezra Kane had finally caught the man tied to his wife's death, and it was the stranger woman, the unclaimed bride, who had helped bring him down. Inside the cabin later that morning, the fire burned steady. Mara stitched Ezra's shoulder with trembling but careful hands, her breath hitching each time the needle pierced his flesh. He didn't flinch, only watched her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and something softer. "You saved me," he said quietly. Mara tied off the thread, sitting back. "We saved each other." May, perched on the bed's edge, clutched Mara's sleeve as if afraid to ever let go. "You're not leaving, are you?" the child asked, her voice small but certain. Mara's throat tightened. She glanced at Ezra, then back at May. "Not unless your father throws me out." Ezra reached into his desk, pulling out a small wooden box. From it he drew a simple gold ring, worn but carefully polished. "This was Clara's," he said softly. "I thought it died with her. But last night proved I was wrong. I don't ask this to bind you, Mara. I ask because you already chose us, and we choose you." Mara's hand trembled as he slid the ring onto her finger. It wasn't ceremony, it wasn't spectacle. It was survival woven into love, grief forged into hope. Tears blurred her eyes as she whispered, "Then I stay. Not because I was abandoned, but because I am wanted." The thaw came late to Hollow Rock that year. Snow melted slow, giving way to streams that sang louder each day. At the spring gathering, townsfolk who once whispered in malice now paused in respect when Ezra walked by with Mara at his side and May between them. The three hands intertwined looked stronger than any badge. Weeks later, a telegram arrived addressed to Mara. One word stared back at her in firm black ink. "Sister." She folded it carefully, pressing it to her heart. Another journey waited, another trail, but this time she would not ride it alone. Ezra stood behind her, hand resting on her shoulder, his voice low. "Some families are written in blood, others in fire. Ours is written in choice." And as Mara looked out over the valley where frost was breaking into green, she understood that love was not thunder or flame. It was a slow, steady warmth, enough to survive the coldest winters.